The first thing officers noticed wasn't a broken window or a forced door. It was air moving where it shouldn't be. Inside a quiet West Valley City home, fans were positioned and running, aimed at a wet spot on a couch, as if someone had decided that one specific patch of fabric needed to dry faster than everything else. Outside, December weather pressed in. Susan Powell, 28, had not shown up for work, and her two little boys weren't at daycare. In the rooms where daily life usually leaves a trail, keys, shoes, a purse, her purse and identification were still inside the house. Her husband, Joshua Powell, would tell police she had been asleep when he left around 12:30 a.m., taking their sons camping on the Pony Express Trail in a desert blizzard in sub-zero conditions. A normal suburban night didn't end like that, and whatever happened next, there would be no campsite confirmed, no clear trail of where the night truly went, only a family suddenly split between the last ordinary moment and a silence that wouldn't lift. On Sunday, December 6, 2009, the Powell house on Sarah Circle looked like any other place where a young family tried to keep routine intact. The day included church in the afternoon, the kind of structured time that anchors a week. Susan and Joshua were married, with two sons, Charles, born in 2005, and Braden, born in 2007, small boys whose lives were still measured in naps, car seats, and who got carried when they fell asleep. A neighbor visited the home at around 5 that evening, after church. It's the last confirmed outside sighting of Susan, alive, at her house. What happened after that becomes a case built from verified fragments, missed obligations, an implausible story, objects left behind, and long hours where the timeline simply won't hold still. Monday mattered in Susan's life. She worked as a financial clerk for Wells Fargo Investments, and Monday typically meant getting up, getting the boys ready, and the daycare drop-off. Instead, the next morning came and she wasn't where she was supposed to be. When Susan didn't report to work and the boys weren't delivered to daycare, the absence wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. People who expected her in specific places at specific times didn't see her. Police entered the home and found that strange domestic detail waiting for them: the fans, the wet spot on the couch. It wasn't proof of anything on its own, but it was behavior, an action someone took inside the house, at the exact moment Susan was vanishing from every external schedule that defined her day. They also found what you don't take when you run away: her purse and her identification still inside. Joshua wasn't at the house that morning. He didn't return until around 5 in the evening, arriving with the children. When police questioned him, the first version of the story he offered was that Susan had been asleep when he left in the early hours and that he had taken the boys camping overnight, despite the conditions. The claimed destination was the Pony Express Trail. But no campsite evidence was found to corroborate it, and the weather itself made the idea feel less like a family outing and more like a mechanism, something designed to create distance in time and geography while a crucial night slipped out of view. That night becomes the hinge of everything. Susan is last confirmed seen at the house in the early evening. Hours later, Joshua says he left around 12:30 a.m. with the boys. By morning, Susan is not at work. She does not appear on the normal radar of her life, and inside the home, someone is drying a couch. In the background, known later through documents and reporting, there were signs the marriage was under strain. Susan's writings reflected fear and turmoil. Financial stress existed in the family history, including a bankruptcy in 2007. Those details don't solve a disappearance, but they shape the atmosphere, a home that could look quiet from the street while pressure quietly accumulated behind the door. Investigators would go on to find physical evidence that anchored the case in the house itself. In a search on December 9, blood found on floor tiles was later confirmed to be Susan's. Alongside that, an unknown male DNA sample was also noted, an unresolved element that adds complexity without providing a clean answer. Susan's remains were never recovered, and without that, many of the most definitive forensic timelines remained out of reach. But in the first days, the most urgent thing was the gap. The question wasn't just where Susan was. It was where the hours had gone, and why a husband's explanation asked everyone to accept an overnight desert camp during a blizzard as the last thing that happened before a mother vanished from her own life. Joshua would be labeled a person of interest, and would never be charged in Susan's disappearance. He maintained she ran away. Police, years later, would close the active investigation in 2013, believing Susan had been killed by Joshua and that his brother Michael may have been involved. Those are conclusions reached after years of searching and review, not statements that arrived cleanly in the first week. In the first week, investigators were still trying to keep the case from hardening into a permanent absence. And then, just one day after Susan was reported missing, after Joshua had been interviewed and returned home with the boys, he did something that pushed the timeline into an even darker shape. On December 8, he rented a car near the Salt Lake City airport. When he returned it on December 9, it carried 807 extra miles. There was an 18-hour stretch inside that rental window that investigators could not publicly account for in full. And before his phone could be properly examined, Joshua had removed the SIM card, then bought a new phone in Tremonton, Utah. By December 14, 2009, Joshua Powell had hired an attorney. 2 days later, on December 16, West Valley City Police publicly labeled him a person of interest. That shift didn't come with an arrest or charges. It came with a message that investigators no longer treated Susan's disappearance as a simple missing person mystery. They were looking at the closest circle first, and they were doing it in a case where the most important details were still stuck behind closed doors. Inside a house, inside a marriage, inside a private history that didn't show on the street. Susan Marie Powell, born Susan Cox, was 28 years old. She grew up in Washington State and, according to available accounts, attended the LDS Church Institute of Religion. She trained as a cosmetologist and also pursued business-related studies through the institute. In Utah, her daily life had the kind of structure that makes a disappearance instantly obvious. She worked as a financial clerk at Wells Fargo Investments, and her routine included daycare logistics and the steady rhythm of weekdays. Sundays were also part of that rhythm. Church attendance is a documented element of the family's schedule, including the afternoon on the day she was last confirmed seen. She wasn't described by her family as someone who drifted. She was described as a devoted mother. She also wrote, journaling personal concerns, leaving behind something many cases never have. Not a prediction, not a confession, but a record of what it felt like to live inside the relationship before everything snapped. Susan married Joshua Powell in April 2001 at the Portland, Oregon Temple. They had 2 sons, Charles, born in 2005, and Braden, born in 2007. From the outside, it is the template of stability, a young family, a suburban home, children still small enough to be carried to bed. From the inside, the research data shows marital tension documented in Susan's journals and emails, including concerns related to finances, church attendance, and Joshua's family ties. There had been a bankruptcy in 2007. In 2008, there was also a video documenting damage to the home that was attributed to Joshua. None of that is proof of a crime. But it is a verified pattern of strain, and it matters because it contradicts the clean story later offered, that she simply left on her own. There was also a document that would later harden investigators' concern into something more specific. Susan wrote a handwritten will expressing fear of Joshua and describing marital turmoil. It was found in a safe deposit box. In a case with no recovered remains, no public CCTV of the critical window, and limited publicly known location data, a document like that becomes a rare fixed point, not a rumor, not an online theory, an artifact that existed before she vanished. Money, too, sat in the background as a provable fact rather than a motive anyone can legally declare. Susan had life insurance policies totaling $1.5 million. That number doesn't explain what happened. But in an investigation where police later said they believed she was killed and concealed, it becomes part of the landscape of questions the case forces. Who benefits? Who panics? Who has reasons to control a narrative? By this point, the digital picture was already starting to tighten into a familiar shape seen in many domestic disappearances. Less about flashy online trails, more about what suddenly goes missing from the data. There's no confirmed online dating or app component in the reliable reporting summarized here. What is confirmed is narrower and colder. Joshua removed the SIM card from his phone before forensics could examine it, and then purchased a new phone in Tremonton, Utah. The effect is clear even without the full reports, a deliberate break in continuity right when continuity mattered most. Meanwhile, the physical story in the home and the investigative story outside it were moving at different speeds. Inside, Susan's personal items remained where they were. Outside, searches began in difficult conditions, with a winter storm and sub-zero desert weather complicating early efforts. Investigators would later search desert areas and remote locations over time, Simpson Springs, Topaz Mountain, mine shafts. Because the case kept pointing away from the normal places a living person would go and toward places meant not to be found. And then there were the children, too young to be reliable witnesses in the way adults want, but too close to ignore. In post-disappearance interviews, Charles, then 4 years old, reportedly said, "Mommy went camping and stayed behind." Later, accounts say he also said, "Mommy dead." The research data marks the support for these statements as unknown, and that caution matters. These are not courtroom facts establishing exactly what happened. They are reported statements attributed to a small child in the turbulent aftermath. Braden, younger still, later made a drawing of a van and reportedly said words interpreted as "mommy in trunk." Again, supported by evidence, unknown. But even labeled carefully, those fragments create an investigative problem that doesn't go away. Joshua's story required Susan to be asleep, safe at home, while he took the boys into a storm. The children's reported words, camping, stayed behind, dead, pull in more than one direction, and they do it in the only place the case could least afford ambiguity, the hours between the last confirmed sighting and the first morning she didn't show. Because if those statements reflected anything real, anything at all, then the case wasn't only about where Susan went. It was about what the boys might have seen before the timeline went dark. On December 10, 2009, the search pushed outward into the kind of landscape that doesn't forgive mistakes. Desert areas where weather can erase tracks and distance can turn a small gap into something that feels infinite. Simpson Springs was one of the areas searched, with conditions still shaped by the storm and sub-zero cold that had already complicated the first days. In cases like this, the early search is a race against time and terrain. If Susan left on her own, there should be a route, a contact, a trace. If she didn't, then every hour that passes changes what can be recovered. Inside the Powell home, police were no longer treating the house as a place Susan might return to. The purse and identification left behind remained a hard, unmoving fact. The wet spot on the couch and the fans aimed at it stayed in the file as a detail that suggested someone acted deliberately in the living space during the disappearance window. And the home search on December 9 would later produce forensic evidence tying Susan to the scene in a way that made she simply vanished elsewhere harder to reconcile. The same search also left investigators with an unresolved complication. An unknown male DNA sample noted in reporting, a piece of ambiguity that didn't fit cleanly into the simplest narratives. Outside the home, the story Joshua offered was still the only full narrative anyone had for the critical hours, an overnight camping trip on the Pony Express Trail with 2 small boys while Susan slept. Yet police could not confirm the campsite. And as the search expanded, the case's most important question wasn't just, where is Susan? It was, where did the timeline break? Because without a confirmed campsite, and without a documented trail for the missing hours, investigators were left trying to reconstruct reality from absence. In the days that followed, Joshua's posture shifted further into legal defense. By December 14, he had hired an attorney, and by December 16, police labeled him a person of interest. That label carried a careful meaning, not charged, not convicted, but central to the investigation. It also signaled that investigators didn't believe the case would resolve through a simple tip or a voluntary return. They were building a case without a body, which means every object and every mile matters more than it otherwise would. One of those objects was the family minivan. On January 29, 2010, police seized it. The seizure matters because vehicles are mobile crime scenes in domestic disappearances, places where a phone might travel, where items can be transporting, where timing becomes measurable through maintenance, fuel, and wear. In this case, the known detail is stark. Susan's phone was in the minivan. That single fact constrains certain theories and opens others. If her phone never left the family vehicle, it suggests she didn't carry it into a new life, and it limits the usefulness of phone pings that might otherwise map her movements. At the same time, the digital trail that did exist narrowed rather than expanded. Investigators faced a confirmed act that broke continuity. Joshua removed the SIM from his phone before forensics, then obtained a new phone in Tremonton, Utah. It's not proof of violence on its own, but it is a confirmed choice to interrupt what the phone could have shown about location and communication at the exact moment those records would have mattered most. And then there was the travel problem that wouldn't settle. Joshua's rental car, taken after police interviews, returned with hundreds of extra miles and a gap of time investigators could not publicly account for in full. Even without a definitive route released in public reporting, that gap functions like a hinge in the case file. It is one of the few places where the story leaves the house, leaves the neighborhood, and becomes a question of geography, where someone could go in that time, what could be reached, what could be disposed of, what could be hidden. If you're listening closely, hold on to one investigative question as the case moves forward. Not what you assume happened, but what the record can actually support, where those missing hours physically could have taken him. The months turned into years with the most crucial absence unchanged. Susan was never found. There was no recovery of remains, and without that, many definitive answers, time window, specific manner, final location, remained beyond what authorities could prove publicly. The search strategy kept returning to hard places, desert areas, remote routes, and later, mine shafts. Those aren't chosen for drama. They're chosen because they match the kind of concealment investigators feared. Then, in 2011, the investigation took a turn away from Utah streets and into a different house, in a different state, Puyallup, Washington, at the home of Joshua's father, Stephen Powell. On August 25, police executed a search there. What they would seize from that home would not be about the Pony Express trail or a wet couch or a missing purse. It would be something else entirely, something that suggested Susan had been watched, recorded, and held in a private obsession long before she disappeared. On August 25, 2011, investigators went into a different house, in a different state, following a trail that had widened far beyond Sarah Circle. In Puyallup, Washington, police searched the home of Stephen Powell, Joshua's father, and what they found didn't answer where Susan was. It answered something else, the kind of atmosphere surrounding her name inside that family. Police reported seizing via videos and images, including material involving Susan. It was a finding that didn't require speculation to feel disturbing. It was documented, it was physical, and it reframed the idea that Susan's conflict was only between spouses. Whatever had been happening privately, she had not simply been living with a husband. She had been living adjacent to an obsession that investigators could now inventory. Less than a month later, on September 22, 2011, Stephen Powell was arrested on charges related to voyeurism and child pornography, charges that were officially unrelated to Susan's disappearance. That separation matters legally and factually. But in the broader investigation, it created a second gravity well, a parallel case that put the Powell family under a harsher, more public light, and it put distance between Susan's relatives and the possibility that this was a simple missing person case with a clean explanation. While Washington authorities pursued Stephen's case, Susan's case in Utah remained stuck at the same brutal threshold. No body, no confirmed location, no direct confession. Yet the investigative file did not stay static. It thickened with documents and with artifacts that had existed before Susan vanished. One of those artifacts was Susan's handwritten will, found in a safe deposit box, in which she expressed fear of Joshua and described marital turmoil. The document didn't accuse in the legal sense, it didn't prove a homicide, but it did establish something courts and investigators take seriously in domestic cases, that Susan had documented fear of her husband while she was still alive in a way that suggests premeditated concern rather than hindsight. The physical evidence in the home also carried forward with more weight, as reporting and court-linked records clarified what had been found. Blood discovered during the investigation was later confirmed to be Susan's on floor tiles. Alongside it, an unknown male DNA sample was also noted, a detail that prevented the case from collapsing into a single neat line. It left investigators with two realities at once: evidence that Susan had bled in her own home, and an unresolved trace that did not, on its face, identify who else might have been present or involved. Even the data that was missing became part of the case's shape. There was no reliable public record of CCTV capturing the incident window. Full digital forensics reports were not publicly available. Custody evaluation details were sealed, and Susan's remains were never recovered. Those limitations aren't footnotes, they are structural beams. In a case that depends on reconstructing a vanished night, every unavailable record is a door that won't open. Still, investigators built what they could from what was confirmed. They had Susan's purse and identification left at home. They had the odd scene element, fans aimed at a wet couch spot, observed when she failed to show for work and daycare. They had a husband's alibi centered on an overnight camp during a blizzard, with no campsite evidence found. They had the documented break in digital continuity, Joshua removing the SIM card from his phone before forensics, and then buying a new phone in Tremonton, Utah. They had the travel gap in the rental car period, marked by hundreds of extra miles and an 18-hour stretch that remained the central geographic question in the file. They had reported statements from the children, treated cautiously because of age and corroboration limits, pulling in directions that did not cleanly support the story that nothing happened at home. By this stage, authorities' position was becoming clearer in public. Police would later state they believed Joshua killed Susan at home during the December 6-7, 2009 window and concealed her remains, possibly with help from his brother Michael. That is an official theory, not a verdict. The evidence pillars supporting it, as summarized in the research data, were not a single smoking gun but a framework. Susan's blood, her fear-expressing will, the children's reported statements, financial pressures and life insurance, and Joshua's post-disappearance behaviors. The weaknesses were also plain and enduring: no recovered remains and no direct confession. Against that official theory, there were claims documented but treated as unsupported. Joshua and Stephen Powell claimed Susan ran away, including an allegation that she fled to Brazil with another missing person, Stephen Kocher, and that mental illness played a role. In the research data, no supporting evidence for those claims is documented, and the allegation is characterized as rejected by police and family and considered unsupported. Joshua's sister, Elena, later made claims about harassment of Joshua, also noted as unsupported in the summary and without documented evidence tied to Susan's disappearance. What's important, in a documentary sense, is how the case became a collision between what investigators could prove and what the family conflict kept trying to narrate. On one side, physical traces, documents written before the disappearance, gaps in travel and phone data, and a home that did not behave like a place someone voluntarily left forever. On the other, a story of a wife who ran away, repeated without evidence, while the known facts, her belongings left behind, blood in the home, the SIM card removed, refused to align with that explanation. And while Susan's case remained unresolved, the lives most affected by it did not pause in suspension. Her two sons grew older under the shadow of a case that had turned into a custody battlefield, with Susan's father, Chuck Cox, fighting for control and protection of the boys as the years passed. It is one thing for police to build a theory. It is another for a family court to decide what to do with children when the central question, what happened to their mother, has no courtroom answer. By early 2012, that custody conflict had narrowed into a single, fragile mechanism meant to manage risk: supervised visitation. And on a day scheduled to be controlled, monitored, witnessed, limited, Joshua Powell would have the boys in his care again, with a social worker at the door. On February 5, 2012, the case moved from long uncertainty into something final and catastrophic. It was a supervised visit at Joshua Powell's home in South Hill, Washington, controlled contact meant to reduce risk in a custody battle that had become inseparable from Susan's disappearance. A social worker arrived to facilitate the visit. What happened next ended 3 lives. Joshua Powell and Susan's sons, Charles and Braden, were killed in an explosion at the house. Authorities reported gasoline was involved and that the boys sustained hatchet injuries. The violence itself was not a theory or a courtroom argument. It was a confirmed event, and it instantly removed the one-person police in Utah had publicly centered as a person of interest without ever charging him. For investigators, it was the worst kind of closure. The person they believed could have explained Susan's last hours was now gone. For Susan's family, it was not resolution. It was another disappearance, layered on top of the first, this time permanent, public, and impossible to undo. After the explosion, the case narrative shifted again, because the legal battlefield that had surrounded the children collapsed into a single fact. There would be no future testimony, no eventual adulthood where sons might speak with clarity about what they remembered, no chance for time to mature fragments into coherent memory. Whatever the boys had seen, whatever their early statements had meant, the case would never be able to test those threads through the natural passage of years. In the months around that tragedy, another legal track continued to move forward in Washington. Stephen Powell, Joshua's father, had been arrested in September 2011 on voyeurism and child pornography charges unrelated to Susan's disappearance. He was convicted in 2012 and later released in 2017. The record matters not because it proves involvement in Susan's disappearance. It doesn't, and he was not charged for that, but because it documented a disturbing fixation and a household environment that investigators had to evaluate as part of the wider Powell family sphere. In the Utah investigation, what remained was a case built from confirmed anchors and enduring gaps. Police had evidence that kept pulling back to Sarah Circle, Susan's purse and identification left behind, a household scene that suggested deliberate action, and blood later confirmed as Susan's found on floor tiles. They also had unresolved elements that complicated any clean finish, an unknown male DNA sample noted in reporting, and major slices of digital and geographic detail that were not publicly complete, full phone data, and the precise route of the rental car's missing hours among them. In a file like this, unknown doesn't mean irrelevant. It means the case contains more questions than the public can responsibly answer. On May 21, 2013, West Valley City Police closed the active investigation. Their stated position was that they believed Joshua Powell killed Susan and concealed her remains, and that his brother Michael may have assisted. It was an official conclusion from the investigating agency, not a conviction, and it was paired, inevitably, with the reality that the case could not be prosecuted without the kind of proof courts require. No remains were recovered. There was no direct confession available. The case ended up in that narrow corridor where law enforcement can say what they believe, but a courtroom never gets the chance to decide. The years that followed didn't replace answers, but they did finalize other parts of the story. The family conflict shifted into the long administration of loss. Custody no longer existed, and the focus became memory, advocacy, and the record. In 2015, Susan's father, Chuck Cox, won control of Susan's estate. Media coverage continued over time, including major renewed attention through true crime reporting and the release of Cold in 2018. Legislative discussions also emerged in Washington and Utah about supervised visitation and safety when a parent is a murder suspect. Policy responses tied to the kind of risk this case made impossible to ignore. Yet when you strip away the headlines and the years, the core investigative problem remains stubbornly simple. Susan Powell left behind a normal life schedule that stopped abruptly, and the case never located the place where it ended. The biggest unanswered questions are not dramatic flourishes. They are practical, measurable gaps. Where exactly did Joshua drive during the unexplained window tied to the rental car's 807 extra miles? What would a full, transparent reconstruction of that route show if it could be verified? What does the unknown male DNA sample represent? Contamination, an unrelated presence, or something investigators never resolved publicly? And most importantly, where are Susan's remains? Those questions matter because they are not curiosity. They are the difference between an official belief and a provable account. In this case, the public record offers only limited ways forward: recovery of remains, the emergence of new forensic opportunities, or documentation that can reliably lock missing time to a specific place. Until that happens, the file stays defined by what it cannot complete. In 2 sentences, the evidence as described in the research data points to a homicide at or tied to the home. Susan's blood was found, her personal essentials were left behind, and she documented fear in a will before she vanished. But the outcome never reached court, and the most crucial missing piece, Susan herself, was never found. If you take anything from Susan Powell's case, let it be this: sometimes the most dangerous part of a disappearance is not the moment someone is gone, but the quiet decisions in the days after, what gets erased, what roots remain unaccounted for, and how long a family is forced to live inside an unanswered night. If you want more documentary-grade cases told strictly from verified records, no rumor, no invented scenes, subscribe and keep Susan Powell's name in the light.